Chapter 5 of Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's Napkins for Peace or Framing the Question. Some brief comments here. Okay, this chapter starts out, and as I have said before, I was a student of Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's, and I actually had 2 years at the Hoover Institution as his student. And one of the greatest things about being at the Hoover Institution was cookies. And this chapter starts off with mentioning the cookies thing. And every day at 4, they bring out the cookies and you could go and discuss, really great things. And, I remember having just really animated and interesting discussions with a Nobel laureate about the OJ trial, because that's what I was there. And, this also did my marriage no good because I had to pick my wife up from work at 5, and believe me, we could get into, it wasn't always OJ. It was a lot of times it was about very interesting things. So that's got nothing to do with anything. And I seized on it because when reading these chapters, Bruce is giving you very important insights into his modeling technique, but he's also giving you kind of a broader overview. And so I think that's great. That's why I use this book in my classes. At the same time, it's important to sort these things out. When is he talking about something to make a broader point? And, you got to kind of sort these things out. We're doing a lot of things at once. And so the asides, not the Hoover Institution cookies part, but this whole thing, this very interesting discussion of predicting the Oslo, predicting a land for peace deal that, the Oslo Accords would end up mirroring, or talking about the research into CEOs and when they are likely to commit fraud. All of these things are very interesting, and they are applications, and they teach things beyond any narrowly defined purpose, I think, right? And but also, we are going through and trying to pick out the linear thread of, okay, what's he revealing? How's he explaining his model? So in this chapter, the overarching thing is about framing the question, right? And he says you got to frame the problem. In his example at the Hoover Institution, when someone said, "Oh, you can predict peace in the Middle East," and he's like, "Well, maybe not." And he says one of the things is you've got to move from more abstract concepts into focusing on the actual choices decision makers face. And so, winning concepts of winning peace in the Middle East, I mean, there can be a lot of things that are in fact abstractions, and you have to get down to actual decisions, concrete decisions over policies that people will make. He also talks about issues. He does this a little later, but he defines what he considers to be an issue. An issue is a specific question for which different stakeholders have different preferences, right? And so it's not a question of, well, how do we fix it? Like if everyone agrees that, hey, we want to increase the economic growth in the country, right? And then you try to find a way of doing that. If nobody has a different point of view on it, no one has a different preference, it's not an issue. What is an issue is when different stakeholders, whether they be groups, organized interests, individuals, have different preferences over outcomes and are thus going to want to work towards different ends. He also defines an issue from his point of view as part of the definition is it requires agreement by some key set of players to settle the issue, to make a decision, right? It is something that requires a decision. There has to be a decision to predict, right? And also he brings up this idea of the status quo, that sometimes when making a choice, there will be a status quo. And he has an example of students trying to frame the question, and they framed all possible outcomes based off of, hey, there's, the status quo on carbon emissions versus all the different restrictions he had. And he said, look, you've got the status quo there, that's good, but, could somebody want to move it in the other direction, right? And so, he brings that up. I thought that was a bit tangential, but in general, though, he's making a good point about you've got to frame your issues in terms of the desired outcomes. And he says, look, after identifying all decisions that need to be made, right? So you're going and you're framing the problem, you're like getting down to, okay, what are the concrete decisions that have to be made? What are all of them, right? And then, what are the underlying stumbling blocks doing these things? And he says you then move on, kind of the idea is you move on from this to determine the sequence of events that leads to optimal outcomes. Now, honestly, this chapter is a lot more, it seems to be a lot more about the preferences and establishing the preference scale. Although he does talk about sequence of moves between Shimon Peres and Yasser Arafat, and he brings up a lot of other issues that in some ways are they kind of foreshadow the following chapters, but he kind of shows how they work. So like I say, this is a more holistic approach that you have to always be aware of that. Okay, the preference scale, right? And this is what I think is really the core of this chapter, right? And so to a student, I would say, yeah, you probably want to read this. You want to go through and read it twice, read it for the whole, wow, that's kind of cool what he's saying about, Perez and Arafat and the process, and yeah, CEOs, how they might do, go on that level, but then go and be, kind of pulling things out. Like, okay, what is he revealing about the techniques, right? And the big thing here is the preference scale. This is what he is fundamental to his model, right? That you're going to have a scale from 0 to 100 that is going to represent all the possible outcomes that the different stakeholders or players want to achieve, right? And this is a very important first step in modeling. Now, you have a range from 0 to 100, and you place each player on it. You have their most preferred outcome, right? Where they sit, you say, what are the most preferred outcomes of each player? This is something that's often known in game theory, and in spatial models, we often talk about ideal points. What's your ideal point on a spectrum, right? And he says most preferred outcomes because he uses plain English, quite honestly. But all of that's the same thing. And you assign a number on a scale. And the numerical interval between these points represents the intensity of preferences, right? And so you've got a measure, so you can say, hey, look, so more than just preferring, right? More than just, hey, strawberry is preferred to vanilla, is preferred to chocolate ice cream, right? We could have that statement of preference, but it doesn't convey intensity, right? How much better is vanilla than chocolate than strawberry? If that was the order I just said, I don't know. How much better is it? Are two of them closer together? And this is the idea of this scale. And a lot of times, he says, hey, look, the estimating of positions on this. I mean, he meets a guy at Cookies and they write it on a napkin just based off of somebody who's an expert in the area making kind of a subjective assessment. And this is very often, as has been discussed, how he does these things. But you've got this point on the scale and it gives you this intensity of preferences. This is essentially supported, the idea of doing this is supported by the von Neumann-Morgenstern utility theorem that, talks about, can you represent choices over risky outcomes and as a utility function, right? And he's doing that. He's not, calling it a von Neumann-Morgenstern utility. He's got his own scale, right? And it works. And the key thing is the scale, back to the top, the range of possible outcomes based on preferences of stakeholders. And the key point here is, what's the range? 0 and 100, right? The range is defined by the preferences of the stakeholders, right? And so he referred to the status quo, that his students had made the mistake that they had the range truncated. They said, well, let's just have the range be from the status quo to greater restrictions in carbon. And Bruce said, don't you think that somebody might want to lower the emissions? Don't you think the energy companies would really actually like to roll back current standards and be able to emit more carbon? And the point is that 0 and 100 are defined by the extreme positions of whoever the stakeholders are, which is why, you go through this process. Who are the players? Who are the stakeholders? And where are where are their preferences? And so we order them in some way from one extreme to the other, and then assign numbers to relative positions. And he said, that is more an estimation, right? That goes into the model. There's no real science to that, except that we understand that people will often make the same subjective assessment when trying to uh, look at a very specific question of what does Yasser Arafat want most, and what would you prefer one thing over another, right? But we've talked about that in another chapter and another presentation. Okay, as you read this, I will be honest. This chapter has been hard for me to summarize. I have listened to it on several walks with dogs, trying to say, all right, what do we got going on? And there are some things in it, like the whole discussion of his model making predictions, right? About Perez has to make this move and this person has to make that move, and how that actually works. That's the black box that we don't have, and so it can be a bit distracting. Also, I find it a bit jarring that he goes into the CEO example. He talks about the drunkard search, right? And this is an old idea that, a lot of times the story of the drunkard search, by the way, if you don't know, is there's a drunk out there on the side of the street under a lamppost, and the cop comes up and, says, "What are you doing?" "I'm looking for my keys." And so the cop tries to help him, and he says, "Well, he's like, "Where exactly were you when you dropped them?" Right? And the drunkard said, "Oh, I was on the other side of the street." And the cop says, "Well, why are you looking over here?" "Yeah, the light's better over here." Um, a lot of times we bring this up because if you're looking at data, or if you're looking at things that are easier to see, right? Then you are often conducting a drunkard search. And he talks about incentives and assumptions people make, and he switches gears. And the key thing I want to say, because you take his chapter for, he put all this stuff in there, and that's what he wanted you to know about, and he wanted to make some points about the role of incentives and the role of analyzing policy. He had some broader implications there. Great. One thing I just want to make sure, especially if you're one of my students, I want to make sure you understand that he switches gears. He says it, he mentions it, right? But when he goes into the CEO example and he talks about the research they did, he's basing that on his selectorate theory model, which is presented in a different book, right? And is in the Logic of Political Survival. And in that model, it's a different type of model, right? It's a different type of game theory. And the use of that model is usually based off of having assumptions about what players want, right? And so you assume that the leader of an organization or country wants to stay in power. And you assume that the followers want private benefits. And so it is a more general theoretical model that makes ahistoric predictions. It makes general predictions without the inputs, right? Whereas his forecasting model, when he employs that, he's making very specific predictions based off of empirical assessments of each player's preferences, power, interest, salience, all those things, right? And so we kind of shift gears there, and I just wanted to, emphasize that. And like I say, emphasize this difference because this is a difference in approach, right? It's kind of the difference between forecasting an outcome, making a specific prediction, to making a general proposition, right? And so what happens in democracies versus dictatorships, right? This is a much more broad generalization about the world. not a specific prediction. And these are different approaches to modeling, and they're very different ways of doing things. And so I think that's just important to point out. But overall, that's what I see in this chapter, and that's what I want to draw folks' attention to.